Hello everybody, my name is Wes Pham, an ADF architect at MSKCC, and in this tutorial I'll be demonstrating how to declaratively render UTF menu models using various ADF Faces components. Now before we get started, I do recommend you going over to YouTube and search for ADF menu. There's a great tutorial that Julie Johnson over at Firebox Training put together. So go ahead and check that out. This is an overview of the steps that we're going to be following in this tutorial. I'm just going to briefly go over what a menu model is, and then we're going to jump right into JDeveloper and start creating this model. Now, after we have this model created, I'm going to be building menus using the listed components, and then finally I'm going to explain a very useful feature in JDeveloper called the EL Evaluate. These are 3 of the 5 components that we're going to be building later on. This is an AF tree, this is an AF menu, and this is a hierarchical view. Now in this hierarchical view you can see that there are actually 3 trees here. Parent node A, parent node B, and parent node C. Each of those trees are going to be constructed separately as its own UTF. And also to note that ADF at runtime will combine the navigations of each of those UTFs into a single UTF. Looking at the menu model structure, each of my parent nodes here are going to be referred to as shared nodes. Within each shared node, it's going to be referencing a group node, and the descendants of those group nodes are going to be called item nodes. Okay, let's dive right into creating an application. Go ahead and create a Fusion web application. I'm going to call it Menu Model Demo. Click Finish. And we're going to kind of just create the skeleton UTFs that we're going to need to create our menu model. Go ahead and click New on Web Content. Select ADF Task Flow. Uncheck Create as a Bounded Task Flow. UTF-1. And we're going to create 2 more. Once we have our UTFs created, we can start dropping off views to represent our JSF pages. Now that we have our UTF structures set up, I'm going to open up the ADFC-config default UTF and drop off a view for us to build all of our components on later. Now let's start creating the XML menu model. We'll start with the default ADFC-config file. Right click on it and click Create or Update ADF Menu. We're just going to call this root. And we're going to do the same for our UTF 1, 2, and 3. Okay, after we generate all those files, you can see they're going to be located under the webinf folder. This is our default ADFC config menu model, and then these are the 3 that we generated off our independent UTFs. Now, once we generated these menu models, what JDeveloper actually does is to create these item nodes based on your view activities. So for example, our root, which was tied to ADFC-config, had 1 view, and the corresponding item node is created off of that. And you can see it's the same idea for our UTF-2, which has 2 item nodes, 3 has 3, and then of course 1 has 1. And another thing that the XML menu model generator does is that it will also generate a manage bean for each of the menu models. So for example, our UTF-1, you can see under manage beans, there is a new UTF-1 being created, and this applies the same for each of the UTFs. Now let's go ahead and start restructuring our menu model so that it renders the way that we want it to. We're going to start by looking at the root XML, and what we're going to do is add 3 shared nodes. So click on the menu under the structure pane, select insert inside menu and click share node, and this will be the reference to the bean. So UTF-1, and we're going to repeat that 2 more times. UTF-2, and 3. Okay, next we're going to move on to UTF-1, and what we're going to do here is create a group node. Okay, and this group node will have this item node as its child. And we can also give a label for the group node. And we can call this parent node A. And I'm going to also label these item nodes as well to make it render a bit clearly. Child node 1. So we're going to repeat that with UTF-2 and 3. Okay, and we're also going to grab these 2 item nodes, drop it off into group node, give it a label. And we're going to do the same for UTF-3. You get the idea. Okay, grab the nodes, drop it off, you can rename them. And that's it. Open up the ADF c-config file and then navigate to the menu JSF that we created earlier. And we're going to start off by building a very simple tree component against that menu model. Search for the tree in the component palette, drop it off, and on the value attribute, bind it to our root menu model, and then we're going to give it a variable name. Right click on the AF tree, insert inside JSF, select the first facet and choose node stamp. And then come back here on component palette, look for link. We're going to drop off the ADF link. On the text, we are going to now bind it to the attribute values that we've defined within our item nodes on the menu model. So for example, here I'm going to type in row.label. If you do this right, you can see that the design view will show the labels right away. And on the action, make sure you do row.doAction. And that'll give you the proper navigation case that's defined on your item node. So go ahead and run that. Okay, now you can see that running this page, you should now be able to see your menu model rendered as a AF tree. Now let's move on to our next component, and before we do, let's try to group these a little better. So drop off a panel tab on the form, and you see there's a show detail item. Just go ahead and drop that tree off in that show detail item. And then on the panel tab, go ahead and put in another show detail item. Okay, so now the next component we're going to build is the tree table. So very similar in concept. Search for the tree table, drop it off, and bind this to the root. We're going to give it a value and a variable. And I believe you can step through all of this until you get to the component value. Here you're going to call row.label. And you can also choose a command link for this and finish. And you can see that it should have created a very similar structure to the AF tree, except now that there'll be columns that wrap the command link. Go ahead and run that. And you can see the result is that it's very similar to the previous component that we created. And now this is a completed AF tree table using the menu model. Now that we have two of these components created, we're going to move on to something a bit more interesting. Let's just label these AF. And we're going to insert another panel tab. And we're going to call this accordion. We're going to drop that off. And inside the panel accordion, you can see that by default it drops off a show detail item. What I'm going to do here is in the component palette, I'm going to search for 4 and drop this off. I'm going to move this show detail item into this for each, and I'm going to do that one more time because we have a 2-level tree. Okay, and then this is the link. And on the for each, we're going to bind it. So the item is going to be root.wrapData.wrapData. Now I'm going to explain this at the last part of the tutorial, but right now I'm just going to go ahead and continue to build this. Okay, so give it this value, root.wrapData.wrapData. Give it this variable name for the for each on the show detail item. So this will be the tabs. The text, I'm going to call this root.label. For the items, we're going to say root.children. And var, we're going to call it children. And finally on the link, we're going to call this children.label. Okay, go ahead and run that. Okay, once the page is brought up, click on the accordion tab, and now you should be able to see an accordion component rendering the menu model that we created earlier. Now let's move on to our next component. Insert another show detail item, and we're going to call this AF menu. And in the component palette, just search for menu like I did here, and drop off a menu bar. Okay, after you got the menu bar, then we're going to create a menu, and then finally a menu item. Okay, now we're going to follow a similar pattern that we did before using this for loop. So under menu bar, we're going to loop through all the menus. And then under the menu, we're going to loop through all the menu items. And here we're going to do exactly what we did before for the accordion. Okay, root.wrapData. And now we're going to call this root again. The menu text will be root.label. And for the nested for, it's going to be root.children. Variable is children, and then finally on the actual link, we're going to say children.label. Okay, and go ahead and run that. Okay, now our page is running, and then if you come down to AF menu, you can see that now we have a AF menu rendered using our same menu model. And finally, we come to our last component, show detail item, and we're going to call this DVT hierarchy. Okay, and come down to this component palette, choose ADF data visualization, and under hierarchy view, drop this off. You can play around with different settings, but I'm just going to keep this the default. And now we have the component. Come down to value, same idea, bind that to root, give it a name for the variable, and again, I encourage you to go ahead and experiment with this at this point. It does show with a lot of different facets I'm not going to use, so I'm going to go ahead and delete that and drop off a very simple link. And the text again is variable name label. And also I'm going to modify some settings so it's a little bit more presentable. So on the node, I'm going to pick 50, 150. So there's a lot of different things you can try to do. Go ahead and run that. And once the page shows up, click on the tab, and you can see this is a very nicely rendered graph of our menu model. Now these are also links too, so if you had pages generated, once you click on these, they should navigate to those pages. And you can play around with the settings, obviously. This is a really nice way to visualize perhaps a sitemap for your application. Okay, a really helpful tool to figure out the values for your expression language at runtime is go ahead, open up your UTF here, and then what you can do is you can toggle a breakpoint and run the debugger. Once that launches, you can see the page is kind of in this constant loading state. Come down to the debugger and then go to the EL evaluator. So this is where you get to play around with the expression to see what types of objects the expressions are evaluating to. In my case, this is what I was referring to before. You can see that root is a MDS menu model, and you can continue to evaluate the expressions to see what the underlying object is. So I found this a very handy tool to figure out how to work with this menu model and using it for various UI components. So hopefully that's a nice tool you can use in your development. And that's it. Hopefully now you have a better understanding of the menu model and how to use different UI components to render that menu model. If you have questions, comments, or suggestions, hit me up on Twitter, and also check out my blog